Hi, welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes for attendees to populate the Zoom room, and welcome to everyone who's joining on the live cast on our Facebook and YouTube and Twitter channels as well. We're so happy that everyone was able to join us today. This conversation is going to be recorded and uploaded onto YouTube for public viewing. This is going to be an open dialogue with Loren, Cardeli, and Alnoor Ladha for the Hunger for Justice broadcast. And now the founder of A Growing Culture, Loren Cardeli.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We are sad to say that due to technical difficulties, Lila June was not able to join us today. So Alnoor and I will be having a conversation. Please feel free to share comments or questions on any of the platforms, and we'll do our best to answer those questions and to cultivate a conversation for you all today. This has been quite a journey, the Hunger for Justice broadcast. We've been exploring themes from around the world, looking at the intersectionality of agriculture and everything. Last week, I talked about how 10,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution shaped society in greater ways than anything else has in the past, right? So as we moved from nomadic to sedentary peoples, and we began cultivating on land, the first walls were built, the first militaries amassed, the first social stratification and hierarchies were really entrenched within societal structures. What happened was we cultivated a population of haves and the have-nots, a population of the peasant class, and then a population of ones who controlled and governed our surplus. This structure that was set in place, that embedded the very patriarchy, social hegemony, and injustices that were existing today. That structure created and shaped capitalism. That structure created and shaped so much of what we're dealing with today, what we are called upon to confront and to challenge and to vision as we boldly try to redesign a society that nurtures everyone and cultivates collective agency. Now, that transition laid rules. It laid the rules of society, of how we think. So much of our response to that has been like, how can we change something that has so greatly entrenched our society? How can we change a way of life that is so long-term? 10,000 years ago is not long-term in the existence of humankind. It is nearly minutes in the day of our existence. Our ability to imagine, to redesign, to cultivate new ways of thinking based on past experiences as well as new experiences, new knowledge, is what we are all called to do. But to do that, we must break those rules, because we are not part of the food chain. We are food chained. We are bound by this linear and extractive thinking. And our conversation today with Alnoor, a co-founder of The Rules, is an organization that was set up to challenge that, to combat those narratives, and to provide optimism and hope, structure into a new way of thinking, a new way of engaging, a new way of envisioning the world. It has been an ultimate joy to cultivate a relationship with Alnoor over the years. He's been an inspiration to me tremendously, and I want to allow Alnoor to correct my wrongs of the if I explained anything. But Alnoor, would you share with us your history and where you're coming from today?
Sure, I can do that quickly. I always find the biography aspect um, of these conversations, I don't know, secondary, but that's just me. I know the journalist archetypes believe in the storytelling of the personal journey. So I'm calling in from Costa Rica right now. I was born and socialized in Canada, East African parents. And I grew up in the anti-globalization movement, and from that work, we started to see the role of essentially economics in climate change. I initially came at this work with a very sort of yeah, I guess climate justice lens, and I had an elder say to me, climate change is not man-made, it's capital-made. Every dollar of wealth created heats up the planet. And when he said that to me, something shifted in me, and I realized I had to see what was happening to the ecosystem in a more structural, constellational way. I had to see these uh, as part of the same polycrisis. And that set me on a journey. And in 2011, a few of us set up the rules, and we sort of ran the rules as an activist collective, largely in support of social movements, mostly in the global south, peasant movements, farmer movements, indigenous movements, etc., economic justice movements. And we also had a think tank arm that tried to get more radical ideas into the mainstream and make them feel like common sense, using cognitive linguistics and memetics and behavioral psychology and other sort of aspects of other tools to hack the meta narratives, if you will, around the ideas, behaviors, norms, cultural motifs that keep late stage capitalism in place.
And where's the rules today for folks that would ask that?
We dissolved the rules at the end of 2019. So we had a sort of year and a half of informally running the rules, and we all had quite a strong critique of the NGO industrial complex. And so we decided if we were going to run this organization, we would do it for a short period of time. And our initial sense was like 10 years. And then we later in the life cycle of the rules, we decided it would be 8 years. And so we pretty much knew from the beginning when we would stop working together, which creates a really beautiful context to make trouble together. Because, this is, first of all, we knew we weren't in the job creation business. We weren't in the perpetuity business. One of the things we said to each other when we started the rules as an official, 501c3 not-for-profit, was that we want to be highly unemployable at the end of this process. And that's how we would know we would be successful. And that was really our only measure of success. And so it just freed us to do very untraditional work, especially the more of the sort of cultural campaigning work. Like, for example, we ran a cultural intervention campaign to popularize the term Wetiko, a campaign called Seeing Wetiko. And Wetiko, as many of the audience will know, is the indigenous First Nations term. Wetiko itself is a Cree word, but there's many versions of it, Wendigo, Wedigo, etc. But what the core of Wetiko is cannibalism. It's the sort of consumption cannibalism that stems from Western culture, and so that's not the type of work you could do, in a traditional NGO, is to run a year-long campaign on popularizing the concept of capitalism as cannibalism. So it gave us a lot of freedom and essentially a self-help group, really, to decolonize ourselves through the process of engaging with the political structures of the system.
And when you say that self-help group, what I think about is kind of how hard it is the life in the activism, how the work is all-consuming, and how important it is sometimes to look internally as well as externally at these issues. And true change starts with the self. And I
Mhm.
know that that's something that you've worked on tremendously. And I'd love for that. Uh, I'd love to ask some questions about that. Kind of, what can we offer to listeners about working and change inwards as a way to maximize our impact outwards?
Mhm. Well, we start maybe with the critique of the NGO industrial complex, because it's not to say that all NGOs are bad in any way. It's rather that the structure of the system rewards the perpetuation and rewards attribution. Taking credit for things and uh, sort of pitching funders and dancing for funders and contorting ourselves in order to exist. And so just by disrupting that cycle in any way, whether that's existing for a time-bound period or having a sort of cultivating a culture that essentially does not value those external validations, I think is critical. But like with anything, even when we talk about capitalism, we have to understand the oxygen in which we're breathing in order to then disrupt that system. And then the related point to that is identity, right? Identity is a huge barrier. Like in a spiritual sense, what most mystical traditions and many indigenous traditions, part of the spiritual practice is to transcend the subject-object duality, the idea of the other. And what happens in activist circles is we're so attached to our identities. There's not a lot of reward for the work we do. You're not going to become famous. You're not going to make a lot of money. And so the sort of peer validation or funder validation becomes kind of all consuming. And I notice there's this sort of culture with the activists where people think they're super important because they've decided to not do something else. There's a sense of sort of our own version of noblesse oblige, and it also happens for organizations, this desire to say, our organization did that. And so as soon as you're going to die, like we just never gave a shit about the idea of the rules or the brand, or like it just didn't matter because we had sort of set up a system that didn't reward us in that way. And so what I'd also say about the inner work then, to directly answer your question, is I don't see a distinction between the inner work and the outer work. What we've seen in traditional kind of new age spiritual communities is that they lack a sort of sense of solidarity and political understanding, and that culture needs to be disrupted because we're essentially contributing to a form of spiritual narcissism. And then on the other side, what we see in activist circles and political communities is this deep lack of spiritual understanding. There's this sort of rationalist, materialist worldview that's a hangover from Marxist historical materialism. And what it does is, I think part of its initial impulse was we wanted to out logic our oppressors. We wanted to be smarter than the sort of Christian liberal elite. And what that did is it sort of spiritually amputated the left, and which is why many people are not attracted to sort of lefty political circles, because they lack a certain joy, and there's a sort of policing and a superiority that exists within activist circles. And part of what I'm seeing is that by having a spiritual practice and seeing the spiritual process as the primary process, and our political work is an aspect, a reflection of that work that we're doing in the world, karmic work, redemption work, etc. We start approaching the work with more humility. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you approach the work with more humility, and you sort of create you instead of seeing yourself as an activist fighting against something, there's more of this sort of post-activist feel of being a healer, contributing in some small way. in a way to issue areas and um, in solidarity with communities whom you're called to, then it becomes this very different uh, sort of relational field. And I think part of the decolonization we have to do is to check that aspect of us that thinks we're doing someone else a favor, or because of the sacrifices we make or the risks we take, that we somehow have an exceptionalism to being good human beings and treating each other with respect and integrity and love. And so, and the shift is happening, and we're witnessing it. And definitely, I think, you know, Standing Rock was in some ways one of the first major catalysts, at least for dominant mainstream activist culture, to bring the sacred into the activist work.
What organizations have you seen that are actually attempting this or succeeding in existing in the nonprofit world, but attempting to break those kind of those systems of, you know, of colonization that exist within it, you know?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, it's hard to say and sort of name organizations in particular. I can more name practices.
Yeah.
And when we look at, for example, many peasant movements and smallholder farmer movements and indigenous movements, ceremony and ritual are at the key of what they're doing, right? So when you started meeting with La Via Campesina groups, for example, the peasant farmer movement, there's an ode to the seed, you know, and altars are built and prayers are said. And I think sort of invoking the more than human world and the more than human siblings and the animistic sort of transrational forces, ancestors, etc., creates a very different energetic field to what we're in service to. And so there are cultures of movements that do that for sure. We're also seeing, you know, there are groups like the Emergence Network, for example, that are trying to disrupt activist culture in general. And the frame I used earlier, post-activism, comes from a Nigerian poet and writer and activist named Bayo Akomolafe, who was one of the co-founders of the Emergence Network. And, you know, we're also, you know, I think wherever indigenous leadership is central to the movement work and to political work, we see this sort of more sophisticated approach to activism. I'm part of a group called the Defend the Sacred Alliance, and it's a loose coalition of allies and activists who sort of champion this sacred activism, who are bringing prayer with direct action. And we are seeing a shift in that culture, but, you know, this is a constant practice. I don't think there's just a way to turn the switch and be in that mode. Like any more animistic approach to worldview, it requires constant cultivation and practice. And yeah, I think that's really the invitation for the activist world. And it does require the decolonization and deprogramming of a lot of processes. And it goes very deep, from the idea of efficiency and purpose to competency to hierarchy. And all of these are embedded deeply within the left.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the big issues of social movements of the left, besides like the self-policing and the circular fire squad dynamics, I think one of the big issues is that so often the middle class or the upper class kind of co-opt movements of rural and populist means, and what happens is the rebranding, the re-language use, like, and everything. So you talked about La Via Campesina, and there's a lot to go on there. I mean, first of all, La Via Campesina is the world's largest membership organization, you know, 200 to 300 million peasants around the world, fisher folk, basket weavers, craftspeople, indigenous. And in 2005, the Nyalini Declaration, they created a language that they shape the language, food sovereignty around what they want, you know? So many organizations bubble up around the world to support these communities, but yet they want to rebrand. They want to recreate, reshape, rather than using the language of the community that they purport to serve, right? Regenerative was birthed out of that, you know? I mean, permaculture is a example of that. You know, when I go to farmers and interact with them in the global south and they say I practice permaculture, it's like I always have that kind of thought in the back of my mind, which is like you know, are you practicing permaculture? Are you practicing your own indigenous knowledge? But there's been that rebranding that has shaped that. And I think like part of this comes down to the embedded hierarchy that you talk about. Like my big inspiration is and one of the things that I've learned from as much as possible is free area dynamics, right? And so the way that we organize, the way that you are engaged in a community, it's important for individuals in the quest for their own liberation to command their own language, right? And so that comes through the participatory framework, right? Accepting, acknowledging, supporting their definition of the terms, their definition of the landscape, and it's like our role is to break that kind of colonized mindset where we embed our hierarchy, whether in communities, because when you see the successes of the peasant movements, when you talked about La Via Campesina, the peasant movements are all organized around non-hierarchical structures. They're collaborative structures where it's either campesino, which was birthed out of the liberation theology and the free Aryan movement, which is around cultural learning circles, where communities come together, they acknowledge their collective problems, they identify them, they go back, they learn for solutions, they search for those solutions. Those students become the teachers to teach the communities, right? And this is what clicks in, is it's like an open source revolution. Like, you know, individuals don't adopt, they adapt. They on it. You create those structures, whether it's, you know, La Via Campesina, whether it's the Campesino, whether it's MASIPEG with the farmer researcher partnerships in Philippines, whether it's wherever in CDAC, and you know, these communities are breaking those hierarchies, create decentralized structures to advance agroecology, to advance food sovereignty, and to advance social and political change. And I think too often in our work, in activist work, we champion those causes by embedding a different cause, like model within ourselves and our own structure. And I think that becomes a really hard, like a big challenge. It's like, how do you exist when you have to have a board of directors? How do you exist when you have to have a staff organizational chart with the executive director on the top and people want to see that presented? Like, how do you exist in that way that mirrors the communities that you're working with, that supports those communities, but then you have to adhere to a different like organizational attitude and modeling?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is the where I think the humility and the practice of decolonization has to become central to anyone socialized in the Occidental mindset. And it's why, you know, traditional development, for example, was just another form of colonialism. And part of the reason is not that these people are all inherently bad or evil or what have you, but their level of exceptionalism, of self-validation, of essentially ignorance, is so embedded that everything they do is a further imposition of their worldview. And if we look at what's happening in amongst the left, think how sort of rooted this is from the way philanthropy works, right? Philanthropy is essentially an externalization of capitalism. A few people amassed so much wealth that they now decide the agenda for civil society. And then if you're in the informal movement space in the global north, and you're outside of that complex, you're essentially working other jobs, deeply unfunded, marginalized, etc. If you want to be within the system, within the NGO complex, you are essentially in the role of contorting to those values. Just by interacting with the funders, you become further colonized in your desire to impress them, in your desire to, just meet your requirements of milestone reports, et cetera, et cetera. And so the entire fabric of the culture is that way. And then there's language. And there was a great article recently by Tiokasin Ghosthorse, who's a Lakota elder. I consider him a teacher, a mentor, a brother. He wrote this article in Cosmos Journal about indigenous language as a potential antidote, if you will. And what you realize is, like, for example, in Old Lakota, it's a language of verbs, right? Everything is active, and there's not this sort of passivity that exists in the English language. And so there's a animistic, alive relationship with the living planet, and that is so central and so rooted in that cosmovision compared to the sort of Anglo-Saxon, Western rationalist, materialist, Cartesian separation, atomization language. And so it's embedded in everything we do. So even when we think we're in solidarity, even when we think we're supporting another group, we are infecting and imposing our colonized approaches. And so if that's true, which I think it is. Now, this is, of course, there's nuance to it, and that's not always true. And but what it requires then is a nuanced understanding of history. If you're going to engage in social change work, and let's take the techno-utopian Silicon Valley libertarian worldview. It's essentially ahistoric, and it's optimistic. It believes that progress is an arrow and things are getting better, and then all of a sudden you get this sort of Bill Gates, Steven Pinker worldview of it's just tinkering at the edges and small improvements and a lot of self-congratulation and this sort of celebratory mindset. But if you took a historical lens and you deprogrammed yourself from this idea of linear Western rationalist time, and you had these other perspectives, all of a sudden your entire field of possibility of how you would approach social change work would completely change, right? There wouldn't be a sort of monoculture approach to economic growth. You would be in the listening, you would be in solidarity, you would be in how do we rebalance the historical injustices that were created, and as Westerners and people socialized in the West, how do we do social change work as reparation and redemption work, as opposed to some career choice we think we can just do, that we could just engage in because we have the right to engage in it. And it's a very different way to approach social justice work. And I don't think many people, especially in the West, have really asked themselves those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it's challenging is because it's like, where do you place yourself in that role, right? Like, as an activist, you go on that journey, right? Like, and I feel like a lot of the activists that I look up to, and that I engage with, they kind of have that story of the naivety in the beginning, wanting to bring knowledge or wanting to do something. They quickly realized, how much they had very little to to teach or to share, and it's like it becomes like a different kind of environment, right? Where I think of a lot of the role of an organization and a leader, and how do you position yourself to not be the leader? It's like the de-leadering the leader. And I think that the success of the Black Lives Matter movement, the successes of it, is because of the decentralized nature, right? And so when I look through and see in the landscape organizations basically becoming brands of individuals, like that's like, we all look at that and we see these bubbling up organizations that center the individual constantly. And the goal in the industrial nonprofit complex is to champion a cause, to champion. It's like, what is your solution? Like, what are you bringing to the global South that's going to change the world? Like, and that's on you. Like, what is that, right? And it's like, now, okay, wait, you only have 10 seconds to answer that question too, right? Like, so like, here's your elevator pitch. Like, what do you got? Now shoot. Like, that kind of framing is incredibly disruptive. I've spent, you know, the last 10 years trying to convince people that look like me that people that don't look like me have the answers, that I don't have a single answer, but that we need to listen, to engage, and to support the ones on the ground, the ones really changing the world. And it's like, but still, we want to celebrate and look up to the philanthropists who take, you know, a drop of the bucket and give it to the grassroots. We want to think that innovation comes from Cornell, Iowa State, you know, Wall Street or Silicon Valley, but yet we don't, it's so far from that. It's so far from that. And so many of the individuals that we've worked with along the way are creating solutions that would form not only the food system, Alnoor, but like the world, right? But to keep it into the agricultural terminology, they're being siloed, they're being ignored, right? And there's this constant like whitewashing, there's this constant appropriation, you know, and this happens kind of nonstop. And I think that's because of the quest for the South, the quest to champion a specific solution, the quest to be recognized as an innovative thinker, and how the system really kind of perpetuates that. You know, one of the big examples for me was, you know, I went and I was in Western Kenya looking, you know, and I had heard about this technique to work with these different farmers. And the problem with the maize is you have the stem borer, which is this little pest that goes in the top and it eats out the maize from the inside. And then you have like the striga weed, which is this crazy weed, which is parasitic. It attaches to the roots of the maize and it basically just like sucks all the nutrients. And it's like, oh, no, you don't. I'm keeping that here, right? Like, and it's like the perfect kind of like thinking of a plant. It's like, I'm not pulling from the soil, I'm pulling from this damn like, you know, valve that's sucking energy from the soil, which is the maize, the hybrid maize. And so basically these scientists developed this technique, and they developed this technique where they plant desmodium, which is a perennial plant. It's drought tolerant and it's nitrogen fixing. They plant it within the maize, right? Then they plant 3 rows of Napier grass around the outside of the cornfield. Now, Napier grass is grown all the time. It's high calorie, low protein. It's forage for everybody's animals, right? And so it's a very popular, but the desmodium is not as popular of a plant. So they were introducing that seed. And what happens is now you have these farmers growing in a polyculture, right? They're growing in a polyculture and there's no more stem burr and there's no more striga weed. Why? Because the striga weed isn't there because the soil is being fertilized. It's being taken care of. It's being nurtured, right? It's not being pulled and extracted from. Now, the stem borer doesn't like the smell of the desmodium. So the smell pushes the stem borer away. The Napier attracts it. And that's why it's called push and pull. And the Napier attracts it. The stem borer lays its eggs on the Napier leaves, and then the goo kind of released by the plant holds them, and the eggs never hatch or the larvae never fly off. Right? It's a brilliant kind of innovative technique. So I heard about this, and I'm with the regional director in Nyanza province in Western Kenya, and we're driving around looking at it, and farmers' yields are going up tremendously. They're celebrating. They're like, look at my field now. But look what happens. Is alongside every one of those maize fields is onion fields and tomato fields and cabbage fields that those farmers are growing on their own property. And they're all in monoculture, spraying chemicals. And it's like, none of those principles were embedded into the system. And so when I start seeing this after farmer, I asked the regional director, I say, excuse me, why are these farmers not using a polycultural model in these other things? Why are you working with them and they're only embedding this into the maize? And he looked at me and he goes, because we don't have a solution yet for onions or tomatoes or, you know. And I said, well, don't you think the farmers? And he said, no, they don't know what they're doing, right? This is a Bill and Melinda Gates funded project, right? This is the mindset that is championed through. Our solution is feeding the world. So now, like on paper, You show that to funders and to philanthropists, they love that, right? When you get to the ground, what you see is a response that's objectifying and dehumanizing ones who grow food. It's like you don't teach this as a principle, right? You're teaching this as the direct model that you have to embed. Don't ask questions, don't know why it works, don't understand why it works. It's just this. And this is that kind of thinking that exists so often.
And this is also, and it's a great example. It's also why I say that the spiritual process is the primary process, right? Because science is not, or technology, these are not things separate from the economic operating system. How could they be, right? Science and technology are subsets of capitalism. Who's deciding on where the research and development funds are going? Who are the people conducting the scientific experiments? Largely white, male, certain socioeconomic background, etc., right? And what is their spiritual practice? How evolved are their relationships to the more than human world, to a living planet, to animate fields, etc.? They're non-existent. And so there's the moral philosophy of this, and it's same with artificial intelligence, right? Why are the least developed, most sort of clever but not wise, technically smart but not holistically developed white male deciding our relationship with artificial intelligence or farm innovation or technology, or it's a serious ethical question, right? And for every solution, there's a reaction of greater proportion in terms of problems. And if look, our best thinking got us here. This is how we got into this place of polycrisis, edge of collapse, 200 species a day going extinct, et cetera, et cetera. And if we continue elevating the technocratic rationalist approach, we're just, we know where that leads. And this is not to say that there's no role for science, but I think we need to reframe science. So science is the floor of understanding through one lens. It's not the ceiling. 100 years ago, we thought the universe was less than 1 billion years old, and now we know think it's 4.6 billion years old. And so science is it's an ongoing raising of a floor. It's a very basic understanding, and it's one way in. But there's infinite approaches, and what this requires is a humility to see these other ways of knowing and being that are in many ways more sophisticated, right? The logic of capitalism is monoculture in every way, right? If we let the logical outcome of the system play itself out, everybody would be using these types of techniques that you're referring to, Loren. Everyone would have Nike shoes, an Apple computer, Zoom, meeting rooms, etc. The listening to Miley Cyrus or Beyonce or whatever. Like, that's the logic. And so if we're being good students of our culture, we look at that logic and we say, well, we have to do the opposite of that logic, which is polyculture. Many ways of knowing and being, many tongues, many approaches, decentralization, etc. And it's the obvious starting place. But you can only get there when you have a critique of how we got here. And then this leads back full circle to the role of activists, especially activists socialized in the West. Is, I don't believe we need self-flagellation or the self-hatred that's happening, for example, amongst a lot of white activists and white communities. Like, that's also not useful, right? We wouldn't want anyone to be in that state, but rather let's take a historical perspective, understand the spiritual implications of incarnating into a white body, during the end of late stage capitalism, in the sort of height of the Anthropocene, where the logic of Western Europe through imperialism, colonialism, wetiko, slavery, genocide, etc., has led to this current moment. And all of a sudden, our role is very different. It's not a sort of role that requires shame or embarrassment. It's a role that says, okay, I've incarnated into this body during this time. How could I be of deepest service to the redemption work of my ancestors? And it also requires a certain type of grief. And actually, it is, in some ways, you could argue, the responsibility of people who have been socialized in the Occidental mindset and have the privilege and the set of privileges that come with being a Westerner in our sort of current model of, you know, McDonald's neoliberalization of globalization, to then sort of use that privilege in a way that's in service to what's happening right now. And that does require grief, because if we don't grieve the loss of culture that is at the root of Western modernity, then we're always going to be looking for something else. And that, you know, there's a saying in psychoanalysis, which is, that which we do not heal, we transfer onto others.
Yes.
And that's really where the development mindset is coming. It's like, we see these intact cultures, indigenous cultures, African cultures, Latin American cultures, Asian cultures, etc. And our loss of being in an intact tribal society where we're held, where there's initiation, where there's a process of spiritual development, our sense of loss is in some ways driving the imposition and the hubris and the arrogance. And until that spiritual core of the Western mind, heart, soul complex is healed, there isn't a solution that's going to come out of that doesn't replicate the same logic.
Well, yeah. I mean, number of things. First of all, next week's talk, Alnoor, is with Vivian Sanzor, Rowan White, Kiki, and Karen Washington. And so it's Indigenous, Black, and Palestinian women talking together, and the title is Composting Grief, right? And so it's really built upon exactly what you want to say. So shamelessly, I want to plug that. Everyone come listen next week. But you know, what you're saying right there is, it's really essential, because I think so often we don't confront our own, like, it's in our own role in the subconscious role of like perpetuating these issues. For me, working in the global South, coming back to the United States, when I look at these kind of causes, the activist groups that are working, we tend to focus on these subjects. Like, you see this, everybody rallying against, you know, plastic straws. They rally against, you know, these, you know, GMOs or something. And it's such this emotional territory that's bubbling up. And to me, it's like, first of all, it's kind of quite impressive how emotional people get about something like that's like a plastic straw, you know, but yet they don't get as emotional about the loss of culture, like the loss of ecocide that's happening, you know. And so when I work with communities all over the world, they're not fighting against GMOs. They're fighting for their culture, and they know that first and forefront. Like and so there's that, like, homing in on that, like, sentient, and that understanding that, like, this is the key to our survival. But yet, in a lot of times in Western or global North, you know, activist thought, we circumvent everything that forces us to look inwards. The environment becomes something like, let's focus on building soil carbon, right? Like, let's focus on stopping pollution, right? But let's not, like, understand our role in those systems, right? So, like, when you have West Africa producing over 75% of the world's chocolate, but yet in less than 2% of the $100 billion revenue. Like, I don't give a fuck if they're regenerative organic farmers. They're still in a system of exploitation that's extracting and pulling from them. But yet we don't want to recognize our role in that complacency, right? And so like good narrative, good work in communities has to hold up a mirror, because if we want to change systems, like the tool already exists. The tool already exists, and it's not a goddamn Tesla, right? It's not a funny looking light bulb, right? It's not an app on your phone. It's a mirror. It's a mirror to allow us to look at ourselves and look at our own role in these systems. If you're not hungry, you're benefiting from the hunger of others. Like, we need that to seep in. We need that. And for so much like of my work in trying to connect dots from these groups in the global South that are fighting for culture, fighting for their survival, that are dealing with America every day because of the neoliberal policies, because of the world trade and, you know, the IMF, like these things confront them. We're in their narrative, but yet in the United States, it's like, oh, we don't focus internationally, we just focus here, you know, or whatever that kind of narratives that funders or media say. And it's like, you gotta be damn kidding me. Because of the feudal policies in Philippines put on by US occupation, a farmer every 4 days is being murdered right now. Like they can't say, oh, America isn't in our narrative. Like, we have that privilege. Like, we want to protect ourselves so hard. And I don't want to get this daunting, because for me, like the ultimate question here is like, for like, and this is personally just my question for you, Alnoor, is like that once you start to unveil, once you peel away the layers of this like proverbial agricultural onion or capitalist society or whatever, like, and you're exposing like the rot, the injustice that exists so deep within there. Like, how do you not get overwhelmed by it, right? Like, how do you not get drowned in that reflection that forces like you to want to go to therapy, that forces you to want to confront your own self, that forces you to like be like, oh, so I don't want to take money from Monsanto, but like a lot of the people we're taking money from an organization might have Monsanto in their damn portfolio. I don't know about that. Once you start to realize how complex and integrated these systems are, it's a shock, right? How and I don't want people who are looking for change to kind of feel that shock and get lost in it. Like how do you mitigate that?
Yeah, you know, it's this is the practice, right? This is what it is to be politically engaged or in solidarity in the Anthropocene. It's to live with the messiness of the duality and the indeterminacy and the ambiguity and the apparent chaos and all of those things. But I think being grounded and rooted in a structural analysis of power is actually deeply liberating, right? Because then you won't be wasting your time just fighting for the plastic straws. When you realize that you know, climate change is a direct result of a set of rules we've created of capitalism, this whole movement for racial justice, right? We're seeing Black people asking for, you know, equal representation in the boardroom, for example, right? And it's like, is that really what we want when every dollar of wealth created is heating up the planet, when every dollar of wealth created, 94 cents ends up in the hands of the top 1%? And so there isn't an issue area from food justice to land rights to you know, animal rights, you name it, that is not directly a result of the economic operating system. And so I think grounding yourself in that understanding and having a structural worldview actually lets you put your time and your energy in the, how do I disrupt this in every single touch point? Every conversation with a funder is a moment to organize and to radicalize. You know, every project we work on, if in some ways it's not undermining that existing system and or offering an alternative that is based in different logic, a logic of interdependence and solidarity and empathy and the diametrically opposed logic to what's holding the system up, then I know I'm wasting my time. And then
Yeah.
also rooting that in a spiritual practice of humbling yourself to the earth and to the plants and to, you know, these other aspects of ourselves, essentially, to ask, how do I be in better service to this moment? And also not trying to fix the grief, you know, not trying to fix the contradiction that we're all in. It's actually sitting with that as a vehicle and an entry point into deeper structural change. You know, I sit in the contemplation of the fact that even though I may better understand how the system works, it's not like I single-handedly can change that system, right? And so instead of that as something that's like a defeating aspect, I see it as something that's, yeah, a kind of, in some ways, deeply liberating, and contributes to the practice. It contributes to the sort of inquiry of, you know, why we do this work. And I think that part of the reason there's such a lack of meaning and sense of purposelessness, especially in the West, is that we haven't shifted our gaze towards you know, dismantling the capitalist system as a spiritual act, as our sort of duty as human beings who have incarnated in the Anthropocene. And when we do that, I feel like it doesn't make it necessarily easier, but there's an opening that happens. And you also start to find the others that are, you know, also conscientious objectors of the dominant system. And there's a camaraderie and a community that is created and built and magnified around this work. And I feel like that's where the real sort of strength comes from. The reward for this work is being with others in circle doing that work.
Yeah, I mean, the world's most valuable resource is collaboration, and it's essential that we, you know, the fuel that we get is in these kinds of conversations that we're having now, where you meet somebody and you develop and you see that camaraderie, you see that kind of relationship that allows you to lean on and inspire each other. You know, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. You know, and going back to what you were saying earlier on, is like what went in my mind was like our relationship to the environment is a reflection of our relationship amongst ourselves, right? As long as we have embedded hierarchy and injustice here, we will never have sustainability, regeneration. I don't care what you want to call it. We won't have that, right? And so like, there's been a number of things that you've said that have kind of enforced this, you know, thinking in my mind, because like somebody who is forced to labor in a system where they're exploited and extract and oppressed, right? They bring that becomes that conditioning that they bring then home. They can pass that on to their family members, right? They can pass that on to the environment. It becomes that cycle, right? And that's what you were talking about with the, you know, psychotherapy. And to me, that's why it's really important to look inwards, because as an organization, as groups working to change, we have to create the kind of collaborative, non-hierarchical structures to actually reflect outwards, to actually create the kind of change that we want. I want to be mindful, instead of, you know, of some questions that I have that I have in the Q&A box. Are you able to pull those up? Can you speak further on the lack of utility and collective flagellation and how you now view cancel culture? Wow. That's a question. What do you think, Alnoor?
Yeah, I can I can attempt. Look, this thing that I said earlier about what we don't heal, we transmit onto others is
Mhm.
is sort of central to this. It's like uh, our culture is sick, right? And by ours, I mean Western, the dominant paradigm. That culture is sick, and so what I'm saying is we should be critical of it. We should be deeply critical of that culture. But, and well, it's not but, it's an and also see our role within that culture. That doesn't mean that we don't have responsibility, but if our job is to police the responsibility of others, then we're going to just amplify this cancel culture. And so um, this is why we're getting to a crossroads where we're realizing that the spiritual and the political are so deeply embedded that you can't do the self-healing work outside of the collective healing work, and you can't do the collective healing work unless we are in that process ourselves. um, and that, we're also not, this line from the Talmud came to me when you were saying, asking the last question, Loren, and I think it's relevant here too, which is, it says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." And I think
Mm.
part of what happens with cancel culture is that there's a sense that people are abandoning it, and so it sort of amplifies our desire to call people out. And there's no easy solution to it except for us to individually commit and commit in community to do this work together.
Yeah. I mean, I bring back for me, it comes down to kind of that free Aryan mindset as well, is like liberation is the humanization of all peoples, right? And I think there needs to be, we need to speak truth to, we need to call out injustice. There's just 100% like there. There also needs to be, we need to work together. We need to find ways to make this change. Otherwise, we will never be able to stand up against a united, system of capitalism, right? Like there needs to be some kind of embracing of the imperfect ally. There needs to be some kind of way that we can work together and grow together and evolve together. I don't know where to draw the lines. I don't know where to, but I try to, look inwards. I look inwards at my own family. I grew up with, amazing individuals, and, who have evolved. My parents have evolved, and they're like, like the things my father said, 30 years ago, and which he would never say today, and which he would be embarrassed on. And it's kind of this process of evolution and the beautiful growth that has existed in the people that are close to me gives me hope in the world, right? That we can all get there together as well. That's something that's important. The
There
every
was a question. There was a question for you around the polyculture technique.
Yeah, the polyculture is called push and pull. ICEPE is the organization that was promoting it. Reach out, Loren at agrowingculture.org. I can send some links and stuff. You know, every activist opportunity, as you refer to them, requires a language that is communicative to the one you are talking with. How do you approach the in the moment uncoding of what language is called for to be an effective activist?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a tough question. And what I'd say is that it's really a practice, right? And in order for us to be effective at bringing others into a more radical structural worldview, um, we ourselves have to be in the practice of decolonizing ourselves, and that includes decolonizing our language, and moving from the mechanistic rationalist, atomized, individualistic, binary English language and other European languages. They're at their core binary oppositional languages that create conflict in their very use. And so how do we cultivate a more animistic living language? You can't have animistic language without practicing a form of animism itself, which is to be in dialogue with everything around us. And so that requires a sort of a certain humility. It requires transcending anthropocentric logic, um, uh, and I think it also requires a deep spiritual practice. And for me, psychedelics have played a really important role in decolonizing my own mind and having a relationship with plants as teachers. Um, but I don't think that's necessary, and everyone has to do that. That's not everyone's path. But whatever form of practice can help you transcend the object-subject duality, whether that's meditation or yoga or tantra or silence or what have you, to actively spend time in that practice as part of your political work. Because if we're not doing that work, then how are we going to create a magnetic pull for others to be attracted to post-capitalist logic? They have to see it embodied within us.
Yeah, I think that was great. Well, I think it's time to, I don't want to hold Alnoor too long here, and it's been an hour.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool.
It's been interesting for me. We pulled this off in 2 minutes before. We thought about how we would organize this session. So it's been great to be in conversation with you, Alnoor. It's interesting to me. I was in East Africa actually, with the Kalenjin tribe, and this elder asked me about the zebra. He said, "How is the zebra, camouflage? That's black and white, and the savannah is either lush and green or dry and yellow, And I wondered about it, and I didn't have an answer, but he told me, he said, that's the problem with you Westerners. You think your lens is the only lens. To the lion, who's colorblind, the zebra is camouflage. And so often you look at a situation where you think that it's only our way. Our eyes are the only eyes looking in there. I think this is the problem with the industrial nonprofit complex, right? Like it entrenches that. I think that's also what you're talking about, the spiritual journey, which is the de-egoing, right? Like, which is also pulling that away, because I think it's the diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, right? The diversity of perspective and lenses at a single problem. Like, too often when we come into the communities, we use our language, our lens, our framing, rather than to just shut up and listen, to learn and to engage and to accept that there are multiple ways of living. So this has been an incredible conversation that has reminded me that every time we get to speak, I feel incredibly blessed, Alnoor. So thank you for
likewise. Thank you,
us.
brother. Thank you for the time, and yeah, lots of love and gratitude to the community who've showed up and engaged and the questions and to growing culture and the Justice for Hunger for Justice series. Thanks for doing that work. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Julia, do we want to pull up the ending so we can show everyone the next week? It's going to be incredible. Vivian is returning to the Hunger for Justice broadcast with an incredible group of amazing women that are just on the front end for change. I encourage everyone to please tune in, be a part of this ask questions, learn, listen. And please tune in every week. Support the broadcast if you can. If not, tune in and share. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you to our sponsors and everybody. We will see you next week. Thanks, Alnoor.
Lots of love. Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
We'll talk soon. Bye, everyone.